Remember those terrifying days of 2020 and 2021. The world had come to a standstill, streets were empty, lockdowns became part of the daily life, hospitals were overwhelmed, oxygen was desperately needed, and families were struggling to save their loved ones. And in India, the second wave of COVID-19 was especially devastating. Hospitals ran out of beds and oxygen while thousands of families faced unimaginable loss, and India officially recorded more than 45 million COVID-19 cases and over 5,33,000 deaths, while the World Health Organization estimated around 4.7 million excess deaths that were linked directly or indirectly to the pandemic through the end of 2021. Now, years later, the COVID-19 story has returned to the spotlight in the United States of America, and this time the focus is on government records, coronavirus research, and a former senior advisor who worked under Dr. Anthony Fauci. So what happened? Firstly, you need to understand the man at the center of the latest controversy, and that is Dr. David Morens. Firstly, let us understand that who is Dr. David Morens. He is a 78-year-old former senior official at the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and the Infectious Diseases. Morens worked under Dr. Anthony Fauci, who became one of the most recognizable faces of America's response to COVID-19. Morens has now pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiring to defraud the U.S. government, and the case is connected to allegations that federal records relating to coronavirus research and government-funded grants were deliberately concealed. Morens is scheduled to be sentenced on November 12 and could face up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. What was Morens actually accused of? Well, according to the prosecutors, Morens used his personal email account instead of his government account, and while discussing matters that were related to coronavirus research. So why is that even important? Well, government officials are required to preserve official communications that are connected to government business, and prosecutors allege that using personal email helped to keep certain communications away from official records and potentially outside the reach of public record requests. And the investigation also examined discussions surrounding a controversial bat coronavirus research grant. Prosecutors said that Morens discussed efforts to revive the grant and counter claims surrounding a possible laboratory origin of COVID-19. And Morens had previously denied intentionally trying to evade federal transparency laws, but by pleading guilty, he has now accepted responsibility for the conduct that is covered by the criminal case. His lawyer, Timothy, said that Morens has taken responsibility for what he did. So what about Anthony Fauci then? Well, this is where the story becomes politically sensitive, as Anthony Fauci has not been charged in the Morens case. However, Fauci has faced intense scrutiny from Republican lawmakers over his handling of the pandemic and questions about coronavirus research. And one of his most vocal critics has been Republican Senator Rand Paul, who has repeatedly questioned Fauci about COVID-19's origin and research funding. And during a recent Senate hearing, Fauci invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination while answering questions. A Senate committee later voted to hold him in contempt of Congress after he declined to answer further questions. But it is important to make one thing clear, that the Morens guilty plea does not mean that Fauci has been found guilty of any crime. So what is the biggest question, and where did COVID come from? Well, and that brings us back to the one of the biggest unanswered questions of the pandemic, that where did COVID-19 actually come from? And the debate has largely focused on two possibilities. One is the natural transmission, meaning that the virus emerged naturally and eventually crossed from animals into the humans. And the other is a possible laboratory-related incident in China. And US intelligence agencies have investigated both the possibilities, but they have not reached a unanimous conclusion. And the FBI has assessed that a laboratory-related origin was likely, while the CIA has considered that possibility with low confidence. And other US intelligence agencies have assessed that natural transmission is more likely. So despite years of investigation, the exact origin of COVID-19 remains unresolved, and Morens' guilty plea does not change that. It does not prove that COVID-19 came from a laboratory, nor does it prove that the virus was deliberately created or released. So why does this matter to India? Well, for India, this story carries particular significance because the pandemic left behind an enormous human cost, as the first COVID-19 cases was reported in India in January 2020, and soon came lockdowns, economic disruption, and widespread uncertainty. But the darkest period arrived during the second wave in 2021. Hospitals were overwhelmed, oxygen supplies became critically important, families searched desperately for beds, medicines, and treatment, and India eventually carried out one of the world's largest vaccination campaigns, administering billions of doses, and yet behind every official statistic was a human story. A family losing someone, a patient fighting for oxygen, or loved ones separated during one of the world's worst health crises. And that is why questions surrounding the pandemic continue to attract enormous attention. So what does this guilty plea actually prove? Well, this is the key distinction. Morens has pleaded guilty to a federal conspiracy charge involving the handling and concealment of government records, and that establishes criminal responsibility for the conduct covered by his plea. But it does not prove that Fauci committed a crime, and it does not prove that COVID-19 originated in a laboratory, and it does not establish that anyone deliberately created or released the virus. So what the case does raise are serious questions about government transparency, record keeping, and how coronavirus research was handled during the pandemic, and the mystery is still unresolved. But Morens will now await sentencing in November, while the wider political and scientific debate over COVID-19 continues. And for millions of people, including families across India, COVID-19 is not just a chapter in history, it was a period of fear, uncertainty, and enormous loss. And 6 years later, one question still remains: that how exactly did the COVID-19 pandemic begin? And Dr. David Morens' guilty plea has reopened that debate and put pandemic-era research and government transparency back under the microscope. But one thing remains clear: that the guilty plea may answer questions about government records, but it does not yet answer the mystery of how COVID-19 began. That's all for now. Stay tuned to the Savera for more updates. Do like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.